This is the story of ethics, its origins, its purpose, its history. Now, this is a very interesting story. I'm going to have to take you back about, 70,000 years at this point, actually. You might wonder why 70,000 years? Well, because quite frankly, about 70,000 years is where the most important event in the history of all of the universe ever really actually happened. Right? 13.8 billion years, and then 70,000 years ago, just bang. Let's turbocharge existence and see what happens. So it's quite interesting. You might think, well, what about the emergence of the human species 200,000 years ago? There's so many other interesting things. Well, quite frankly, it's not that interesting. So let's go straight. Like, why 70,000 years ago? Why the most important event, right? The human species has been around for about 200,000 years now. Talk about that. Well, no, not really. For about 200,000 years of that history, for about 200,000 years of the history of humanity, like, nothing really interesting happened for about the first 130,000 years. No, it was only around when speech itself began, and this is where I'm getting to the most important event in the history of history. So, it doesn't, like, there's a lot of great videos you can watch already on the web about the history of everything, right? The history of everything, I guess, right? That's a great video. Lots of great videos. Neil deGrasse Tyson, Carl Sagan, a lot of great thinkers who have brought together the cosmological timeline. But let's just focus on 70,000 years ago, because it was 70,000 years ago, even though humans weren't much to look at for a long time, suddenly they were. Suddenly something happened. This has been described as a magical and terrible event. Something happened to our minds. What happened? Well, what was much more important than what happened to our minds was much more important than what happened to our genes. Because around about 70,000 years ago, a particular mutation on a particular gene, known as forkhead box protein P2, took place. And it was with this event that the world and the universe as we know it would never, ever, ever be the same ever again. This gene, 735, 635, I can't recall the exact number of nucleotides. This gene is long. Nucleotides being the rungs on the DNA ladder, the nucleic acid information, which then translates into protein information, right? The genotype and the phenotype, the expression of underlying information into action, into synthesis, into reproduction, into metabolism, all of these wonderful, amazing things. And this particular mutation, this gene is extremely extant in the vertebra, the chordate lineage, right? It's important in basically all major vertebrates, from whales with their echolocation. This has been kind of called the language gene, the vocalization gene, which is very important. And songbirds, right? It's incredibly human beings, chimpanzees. If you modify this gene, you create all sorts of weird side effects, right? Like mother mice can't distinguish really well their own pups from little fuzzy rocks, right? Because they're not creating the right ultrasonic frequencies. They're not expressing what nature intended to in this sense of those high hertz noises that would reinforce the existence of a mouse's offspring, right? So you modify this gene, you modify the capacity for vocalization, speech, interpretation significantly. In fact, 70,000 years ago, this gene alteration in our species took place, and there are actually families around the world who don't have our version of the gene. Not the human version, the version we all take for granted that occurred, a split from the rest of the Homo sapien, well, almost all of the Homo sapien lineage, 70,000 years ago. And they can't communicate. with us in any real way. They'd have no process for real conceptual abstraction, for the ability to synthesize knowledge and speech, metaphysics and epistemology. So let's begin at that 70,000 year point and go forward, and we'll get to where we are today very quickly. 70,000 years ago, conversation started, and I wish I could tell you there's a lot we would know about the very beginnings of conversation. Unfortunately, there's not much we can know about conversation, though we can know some things for sure, which is really important. The first thing we know is that language itself, even with FOXP2, is an emergent phenomenon amongst networking components. In other words, it never develops in isolation. How do we know this? Well, we know this because of two very wonderful stories. One not wonderful, but informative stories. The first is that the most recent language on Earth, at least last time I heard, although last time I heard actually AI had constructed its own language, so that might need to be revised. But it was a Latin American sign language. I believe it was Cambodian Sign Language, where some government aristocrat had some relative that didn't actually have verbal communicative capacities, and there was no ESL, no English Sign Language around, so it was her, or his, I think she was a woman, her desire to get a bunch of the deaf children in Cambodia together and form a kind of school. Although there was nothing to teach them, there was no way to communicate with them, and yet they desired to do this anyway. And so when all of these children were brought together, lo and behold, they created their own language together, spontaneously, without any order or without any instruction on how syntax or semantics works at all. What a fantastic, beautiful thing, right? This is why when you get multiple AI bots together and they start creating their own language, you're like, what? Okay, this is very, very interesting. The other reason why I say language is a networked emergent phenomenon is because there's a very unfortunate tale to be told about a very unfortunate human being who underwent the most tortuous period of deprivation and isolation in all of recorded medical history. Now, I'm bringing together a lot of huge facts here to try to build a big theory of ethics, right? And so this is why I'm going through this history. Many of you will know the urban legend behind her story, but not many people know the actual story itself. Indeed, her her alias, she is known by an alias, Jeannie Wiley. And until the age of 11, she underwent a period of existence by which her father kept her either strapped to during the day, a potting chair, or at night bound, caged inside her crib with chicken wire over the top to keep her inside. And during this entire time, he did not talk to her, and he instructed his son and his wife never to talk to her. And as psychologists had long believed, there was a period of critical development in which language is acquired through an outside medium. And if this period is lost, if a person is not, Jeannie Wiley acquired a huge vocabulary. She knew hundreds of words, perhaps 300 or 400 words, I'm not sure. You'd have to ask the wonderful scientists and linguists and neurologists. Oh my goodness, looking at her brain through an fMRI, it was like looking at Swiss cheese. But you'd have to talk to them about the real true number of vocabulary that she developed. But she never developed syntax. She didn't develop grammar. She couldn't properly function in the way that we all take for granted of forming sentences, as I'm doing now, right? As I'm literally in front of you talking about the ability to form sentences into coherent ideas. And so we move forward. So what can we know about this first conversation on Earth? Well, the first thing we know, because of this evidence, this empirical reality, is that Language does not develop in isolation. It is a networked emergent phenomenon. Therefore, the first person to have this mutation 70,000 years ago, it would not have aided their survival in the way that we believe, the way that we understand it affects our own survival moving forward, right? We've developed hunting weapons far exceeding any animal on Earth, right? We take this for granted. And yet, this capacity did not aid this person because there was no language. This first person didn't even have a language to talk to themselves inside their own head, which is it would only happen as a result. So you might think, okay, so the first person, they won't develop language, right? But then they'll give birth to a child and then they'll talk to that child. But that won't happen either because they, as an adult, will have missed the window to develop language. So the first conversation was not inside that individual's head. It was not with their offspring. No, I dare to be so audacious as to suggest this very important idea that the first conversation, the beginning of conversation on Earth, was a conversation of siblings. This first person managed somehow to survive and to reproduce, and it managed to survive and reproduce twice in a relatively narrow time span, enabling those siblings to develop their own language. And it is there, 70,000 years ago, from which our journey of ethics springs. And yes, there's a lot of other, like there's physics and there's mathematics and there's a bunch of wonderful places. But the most important thing to talk about is ethics, right? Because that's the dismal science beyond the dismal science of economics, right? And though I know a lot about economics, I'm here to talk about ethics because, well, that's what people find of value, right? And so there's the automatic thing, right? You know, the understanding of economics, right? If you know economics and ethics and somebody says talk about ethics, it's like, okay, let's do that. So we move forward constantly. 70,000 years ago it starts, but it's very slow at the beginning, right? This is generally how a sort of asymptote works. And we get to around about the beginnings of, and I would love to talk about a bunch of different other fields of language, but I have to focus on ethics here because it's got to be concise going forward. I got on too many tangents myself. So around about 13,500 years ago, so 55,000 years later, give or take, the first civilizations emerge in Jericho, the Middle East, and various other places, and they all begin to very quickly, although the earliest, I think, known example of ethical codification, is it Hammurabi's Code from ancient Mesopotamian Babylon? It probably is. You know, the pre Old Testament, the pseudo beyond barbarism system of ethics that it was all just going along with at that point. So ethics begins to be codified in writing, which is a very important thing. And it occurs simultaneously all over the earth around the time of, well, at least the written surviving examples are these writings from cuneiform and other forms of writing around about 4,000 years ago. This whole thing sort of takes a huge, gigantic leap forward, and I use the word forward in a very interesting way, with the Old Testament chronology in the Bible. Now, here is where we get to the real juicy, okay, so I'm sorry, Plato. Okay, you spilt the beans to the rulers 2,500 years ago, but we have to go back and we have to tell everybody about it because it's no use pretending this is just going to solve itself, the problems of ethics. So here's the real meat of the issue. A thief is a kind of profession. It's not a real profession because it's using violence, aka stealing, to get what it wants, but it is in a very real sense seeking to okay, really, I even referenced this. I'm going to put in a disclaimer at the beginning of the video. Don't use this for evil. I'm fucking not fucking kidding around. Ethics, the history of the dark arts, the way that evil wizards operate, the way that immoral ethicists rule the world is through their sophisticated control of ethics. This all begins around about 4,000, 5,000 years ago. It took a very long time for language to get to the point of where ethics were capable of this sophistication, this level of sophistry, and yet it occurred, and we are living out the problems associated with this discovery for evil. You see, the human mind does not need to, by definition, conform with reality. We can lie. I can sit here and stare the camera right in the frickin' lens and say, I am a pineapple. Sorry, pineapple, colon. But it doesn't make it true. If there's one very easy to understand capacity for the human mind, it is that it can misrepresent reality whenever it wants to. People can claim they don't exist, right? Well, if you don't exist, you can't claim anything, let alone the fact that you don't exist, right? This is where we're getting into the metaphysics of speech and a whole bunch of other stuff I've already started to talk about and expose to you. And you're asking, why am I exposing this to you? Well, because quite frankly, this shit was exposed to the rulers 2,400 years ago, so you can handle the truth, and I'm telling it to you right here and now. And this is nothing new. The suppression of knowledge. My goodness gracious. The Platonists, the Pythagoreans, they suppressed knowledge in mathematics. And think of how concrete mathematics is. 2 plus 2 is 4. And yet they were able to suppress knowledge there. Right? They suppressed knowledge of the square root of 2. Because the square root of 2 is irrational. And the Platonists, the Pythagoreans, who followed Plato, believed that all of reality was derived from whole numbers. And therefore, certainly all other numbers. Right? Carl Sagan talked about this. Right? If the square root of 2 is irrational, and we believe that rational numbers are an absolute, there's clearly something wrong with our way of looking at the world. Maybe we should change that. Well, they didn't do that. Instead, they suppressed knowledge of the square root of 2. They suppressed knowledge of the dodecahedron. And yes, Dave, I am looking at you, or looking at the dodecahedron little terrarium you have over there. Is that what a dodecahedron terrarium? Something like that. But they suppressed knowledge of the dodecahedron. Again, in mathematics, right? Did it ever occur to you to wonder why nobody knows what the fifth element is? Nobody knows what well, I mean, it's love, or it's heart, right? The heart thing, or it's Mila Jovovich, and something, right? But no, nobody knows. Well, why does nobody know what the fifth element is? And why do we talk about the fifth element when nobody can really define it, right? The earth, fire, air, and water. 4 elements. The fifth element, the dodecahedron. Well, the reason why no one knows what the fifth element can really define it, is because originally only 4 were known. The perfect solids, the Pythagorean Platonists, the Platonic solids, Pythagorean solids, the perfect solids. There were originally only 4 known in a very rapid period of time. The D4, the D6, the D8, and the D20. And it was used even by Aristotle, who I am very much arguing in the favor of Aristotelian empirical philosophy at the moment. Even Aristotle believed that the constituents of reality were those 4 elements. And these people used the fact that there were only 4 perfect solids as not a causal explanation, but they used it as a corroborating indicator, right? Rather how Johannes Kepler, over 1,000 years later, would use the Platonic solids and the discovery of, because he incorporated the dodecahedron right later, because he knew about the dodecahedron. He used it as like a corroborating indicator of the fact that you had these orbital ratios of the six planets, right? So when the dodecahedron was discovered and widely popularized, the Platonists, the Pythagoreans, suppressed knowledge of the dodecahedron. They didn't really have to, because there was no reason really to, beyond the fact that it suggested just that the correlation that there are four elements and four Platonic solids suggested that their worldview made no sense. No sense whatsoever. So if knowledge in an area of human endeavor as concrete as mathematics can be suppressed so wonderfully, imagine what has happened in an area of human knowledge as fluid in a way, as ethics or economics, right? So let's go there. Let's talk about ethics and economics, because this is not economics. We'll get to that some other time, but really ethics. So ethics is here fundamentally to serve the purposes of evil, not of good, right? Imagine, so as I mentioned earlier, being a thief is a kind of profession. And at most professions, most jobs, they have a sort of duty list, a kind of priority list, where at the top of the list are the tasks most importantly associated with your job. Near the middle, you should hope to get to as soon as you can, and near the bottom, it's like they're not important, but please, if you have extra time, get to them. Now, man, on the duty list of a thief, what do you think is the highest, right? Like, a lot of people will associate the most important duty, the most important task a thief has to become proficient at, is the act of stealing itself, right? As a thief, some of your time is spent sleeping, some of your time is spent eating, doing other things, some of your time is probably spent reconnoitering to gain information about how to effectively raid the savings of others. Some of your time will be enjoying the fruits of your labor, consuming that which you have stolen. Of course, on the list there will be the act of stealing itself, where you actually go out and perform the act of taking property from someone. And you might think, and I think there's general intuitive reasons to believe, that the perfection of the act of stealing itself would be a naturally high priority for thieves. And it's like, so by that definition, the ultimate thief on earth is the ultimate pickpocket. But that's okay, so here's where we get to the interesting part. I hope this has been interesting already, but if this has not been interesting enough, this is where your mind really gets blown. So, the real job of the real thief is not to perfect the art of stealing. That can be outsourced, right? I mean, tax collectors exist. The real job of the real thief is the adroitly applied, sophistic application of ethics to convince other people that want to steal that stealing is wrong. Right? Because what? Right? Because I know I'm going to start to wonder. Right? Because what? The peripetics. Right? Because what happens when I make a really sophisticated, passionate, and powerful case to you that stealing is wrong? There's only so many thieves in society. There's only so much stuff in society, right? You will harm your soul. You will burn in hell should you wish to attain the divination of heaven. You must abstain from this. Why are you doing this? Everything that you have thought you will gain, you will lose. And look, this has, even if you don't believe in heaven and hell, Think about yourself here in this world. What do you stand to lose here? What do you stand to lose that you know about? There's a commandment in the Bible. Yeah, but forget the commandment in the Bible about thou shalt not steal. You'd stand to lose far much more of tangible reality in this world. Everything you gain from stealing, you lose literally at the end of your life. And the last moments on earth when your time here is over, Aristotle pointed this out. The only true happiness in this world is virtue. It is integrity. You might think yourself happy by stealing, and yet all you have, in the last moments, all of the things you have enjoyed, all of the wealth, all of the drugs, all of the sex, everything you've enjoyed will be nothing. And those last precious moments that you have, the only thing you will have is virtue, your happiness, or you will have nothing. You need to put it back, and you need to stop stealing. It is with this realization in hand that you can actually achieve the happiness that comes from living a life of goodness. It is that, right? So what am I doing here? What sophistry am I throwing out at you? I'm convincing you, I'm doing my best. I hope it's a good monologue to convince you that stealing is wrong. Now, why would I do that? Well, if I'm evil, which I'm not, but if I were evil, which is most wizards on earth, I am doing this as a spellcasting method to convince you that evil is wrong and you should not participate under any circumstances. Because that gives more for me. Economics is a 101 system. It is. There's only so much stuff in society, right? The fewer thieves there are, the more each individual thief gets. Steven Pinker wrote a great book about the end of violence, where humanity is becoming more and more moral. Now, why is that happening? It's not happening to bring about a sort of funky-dory kind of paradise on this planet. It's happening because thieves want to maximize their profits, and they use ethics to do it. Now, this is far worse even than thievery, and I'm going to get to that in like the next thing here when I'm talking about this, because you think thieving is bad, counterfeiting. If an alien came to this, okay, so we're going to continue on here. If an alien came to Earth, they would be like, wow, human beings are obsessed with counterfeiting. They just do it constantly. Not all human beings. In fact, most human beings, again, Steven Pinker, The End of Violence, most human beings don't counterfeit. Why? Because a few individuals on this planet are counterfeiting like crazy. If you deny this, you haven't been paying attention to government fiat currencies for the past 100 years, spearheaded by the United States and the Constitution, which is beside the Old Testament. Well, no. To be honest, I think the greatest, most destructive ethical systems in all of human history have been the United States Constitution, followed kind of closely by the Bible, although, of course, the Old Testament chronology, the Old Testament system of ethics, deeply inspired all of the sort of roundabout ethical evolution that led to the Constitution, right? Okay, so people who know the Constitution well, and we're getting into now the second big realm of profitability of evil, which is not necessarily even stealing, taxation, but we're getting into something far deeper, which is counterfeiting. This is, whew, damn. You want to, if you don't want to look into the eyes of evil, you should turn this video off immediately. And if you are going to use this video for evil, you should turn this off immediately. So, scholars of the Constitution I use that phrase with quotations, scholars of the Constitution, will claim that the reason why there are several provisions, tenets in the Constitution, the two big ones I'm going to bring up here are now, and this is where I'm trying to bring it all together, right? Why does ethics exist? Why do we have ethics? Ethics is about evil. I cannot reiterate that enough. Ethics is about the profitability of evil. Evil wizards and good wizards too, when they're doing their job properly, use ethics. When good wizards are doing their job properly, they use ethics as an example of how to live a good life. But evil wizards use ethics as a way to enhance their evil and to make the componentry, whether verbal, somatic, or material, of their spellcasting more profitable and more effective. So the Constitution has two provisions. I can't recall the exact terminology, but there is to maintain a gold and silver standard in money. Gold and silver are mandated by the Constitution to only be legal tender, right? But the Constitution also outlaws explicitly emitting bills of credit. Now, if you don't know the language, anyway, if you don't know the jargon of the time, emitting bills of credit might be a fairly foreign term to you. But to somebody who knows what that means emitting a bill of claim on resources you do not own, ergo counterfeiting. Now, the Constitution outlaws counterfeiting and maintains that the government must be mandated on a gold and silver standard is because the founders who wrote the Constitution and those who inspired the Constitution, specifically Hamilton, who was in love with counterfeiting and thought it was right and just and natural for the government, the sort of unstoppable force of violence. Thanks for explaining us as the monopoly of violence on tape. Barack Obama. What is government, Barack Obama? It's a monopoly on violence. Yeah, it's true. It is. Okay, so Hamilton, who was obsessed with counterfeiting, right? So why would you do this? Now, you might think, well, okay, you're a scholar of the Constitution, and you're like, the Constitution clearly outlaws emitting bills of credit and maintains a gold and silver standard because history is literally festooned with thousands upon thousands of government fiat currencies that have all imploded. So by outlawing this system of currency, by maintaining that the highest law of the land will detract from this practice, this will prevent it from happening. Bullshit. And the exact opposite is true. The Constitution was not written to stop the government from counterfeiting. If that were true, the evidence would match, right? I think most people watching this video will know that this region of this rock that most people call America has begun runs on counterfeiting 3 times, up to and including the current system with the Federal Reserve Bank, which has been active for 100 years now, over 100 years. So it doesn't matter. Like, this is Platonism versus Aristotelianism. Again, forgiving Aristotle for the 4 elements thing. When the evidence does not match the theory, Aristotle argued we throw out the theory and we go with the evidence first and then discover the theory that matches the evidence, right? This is Darwinism, right? You start with the evidence and then you discover the theory. Plato thought and taught something very different, especially after he saw the man he loved and all the world nuked by the state with hemlock for corrupting the youth and for heresy. Plato taught, that in so long as our theories about the world are rational, in so long as they are internally consistent, we should look for the evidence that supports our theory to corroborate it, to enhance it. And this doesn't work if our theories are irrational. But it does work if they're consistent, if they're rational. And this is how we operate. This is why people think the Constitution will stop the government from counterfeiting at its very basis, right? The Constitution was written to get you and I not to counterfeit it. The true goal of the true counterfeiter is to be the only one who does it, right? If everybody counterfeits, there's no point to counterfeiting. If you're the only counterfeiter or the biggest counterfeiter, that is optimum for you. That is optimum for you. And this is why systems of ethics are created and why they are imposed. It is to increase the ability for evil to be more efficacious in what it does. Evil in isolation is basically useless. It is useless. It is only when evil encounters virtue that evil can truly metastasize, because it is evil that provides the wherewithal to move forward from here, to move forward with systems of ethics, to become more profitable at what you do. So this is the challenge at hand. We have to take away ethics from evil. But the problem is that historically, whenever people have done this, as I mentioned, they get handed a cup of hemlock, they get crucified, they get exiled, whatever it is. The evil intervenes for the sake of its profitability. So where do we move from here? Well, the first thing we do is we expose ethics for the con game that it is. And then the second thing we do is we teach this, most importantly, to children. It is the ethics in which we raise our children that will actually dictate. Evil has known forever. This is why religion and government get their hands on children as soon as possible. What goes into children's heads will be the reflection of the future. If we want a world without evil, we need to teach a generation of human beings, perhaps two, about what real evil is, what its mechanisms are for operating, how it does so, how it maximizes these operations. Right? The Bilderberg Group is a real thing. They are really out there doing what they are doing, and we are desperately trying to expose this system for what it is. To sort of bring this to a conclusion, I want to acknowledge another good wizard on earth, one of the few other good wizards I know, Stefan Molyneux. He's given 2 speeches publicly twice, only once. They are his speech on his theory of ethics, to which I owe a great deal of my own knowledge. And it is, I'm just going to check this really quick. I think it's still going, but it's we'll see here. But it's his speech on his theory of ethics. I'm bringing it all together really quickly, and in it he describes a thought experiment. Imagine that no one on earth ever thought of stealing stuff, just ever. And then one day you hit you fall down and you hit your head so hard that you become a sort of kind of semi-politician. And you think to yourself, hey, maybe I can just take stuff. Think about how easy it would be if no one on earth had ever thought of stealing stuff, right? Because there's no locks. There's no passwords, right? There are account names, but there are no passwords. You just log in by typing in your account name. No one steals. You might think, well, of course they would, but no one's ever even considered it. Imagine a world with no locks. So you then get up and you say to yourself, I can take stuff. So in this circumstance, you could literally walk into someone's house, take their TV, bring it home to your home, right? And what would they say? Well, holy, my goodness, where's my TV, honey? Did I bring it over to Tons the other night. I must have missed. Maybe the space aliens have beaten it up for research purposes. I'm sure they'll return it soon. Right? You could try to steal a shirt right off of someone's back, and it would never occur to them that you were trying to steal it. All they would think to themselves is, my goodness gracious, there's something really wrong with this person. What's going on here? So the lesson to be learned is that the very last thief on earth, the very last counterfeiter on earth, has it absolutely made. And so, the next question then becomes, how does one go about becoming the last thief on earth? Ethics is the answer to that question. Thank you for your time.